All right, so for my presentation, I'm going to be looking at the Bosnia and Herzegovina conflict and the Rwandan genocide, and how the United Nations approached them differently and perhaps reacted differently to each of them. So, first, I'm going to talk about the Bosnia and Herzegovina conflict and what happened there, and then do the same for the Rwandan genocide, and then compare the two and do a little final overview. So to begin with the Bosnia and Herzegovina conflict, the different parties involved included different ethnic groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and these were the Bosnian Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, which also may be referred to as Bosniaks. And so the Serbs were generally on one side, and then the Croats and the Muslims were on another. So the supporting parties of the Serbs were Serbia, as the Serbs I'm talking about are Bosnian Serbs, and also the Yugoslav National Army, the JNA. The supporting parties of the Croats and the Muslims were the European Union and the United States, mostly Clinton. He's the one that really pushed for aid for them, and to some extent the United Nations. They did try to remain neutral in the situation, however, they did need to send peacekeepers in order to protect the Muslims that were being ethnically cleansed. So that's why I'm listing them under that that heading, I guess. It occurred over the years of 1992 to 1995. It was 3 years long. The conflict really escalated after Bosnia's declaration of independence from Yugoslavia. This was because the Serbs voted to remain with Yugoslavia, and the Bosnians and the Croats, or the Bosnians, the Muslims and the Croats voted against them, and so they won out as the majority, and so they declared independence. The Serbs got really angry because their constitution stated that there must be like a whole consensus in order to do anything, and that's how the conflict really started. In 1995, the Dayton Peace Accord was signed in Paris. It was signed following a NATO airstrike during the following the Srebrenica massacre. And the accord creates two entities, one for Serbia and one for the Croats and Muslims, which is called Bosnia and Herzegovina. All right, so what happened? Yugoslavia began to collapse. Bosnia and Herzegovina votes and declares their independence from the failing country. War breaks out between the Bosnian Serbs and the Croats Muslims. But that being said, alliances, they became really convoluted during the entire conflict. So depending on the region, the Croats might have been allied with the Serbs. The Muslims may have been allied with the Serbs against the Croats, but the Serbs were against the Muslims. So it was this huge, it was a really complex kind of alliance system. But generally, it was the Serbs against the Croats and the Muslims. There was an ethnic cleansing in all territories. And so these territories were all over Bosnia, but the ethnic cleansing was not only from the Serbians onto the Muslims, because we will be talking about that mainly, but it is important to remember that the Muslims also retaliated, as did the Croats. So UN peacekeepers were sent in 1992, and safe havens were created by the UN for Muslim Bosnians, and they consisted of Sarajevo, Gorazde, and Srebrenica, as well as their surrounding areas. So this is a mass grave of Muslim corpses found outside of Srebrenica. There was a huge massacre. Over 7,000 people were killed. And then this is, I don't know how to say that, Ternopolje camp in Prijedor. It's in northwest Bosnia, and it was basically a modern-day concentration camp, so a really, really horrible, gruesome scene. So where did it occur? It occurred in Bosnia and Herzegovina, right here. And then to the right, I've made a little map, or I didn't make it, I found it, but I put a few points on it. And so it includes here the camp that we saw the picture of, the Ternopolje, I believe that's how you say it, is right there. And then directing our attention over here, we have Sarajevo right here, we have Gorazde right here, and we have Srebrenica right here. So this entire area was kind of a safe haven for Muslims with, just around these big cities. Why did the conflict start? As we mentioned before, the Bosnian Croats uh, and Muslims outvoted the Bosnian Serbs in a declaration of independence from Yugoslavia. This was not only because, but also contributed a lot to the eventual fall of Yugoslavia, which it created a lot of tensions between the two sides because the constitution calls for consensus. Um, so it led to really different nationalistic groups. Um, and yeah. So how did was this conflict able to occur? And we're going to be looking at that through the lenses of analysis, all three. Systemically, Eastern Europe was really unstable at the time due to the very recent USSR collapse. So all the countries were kind of shaky, especially as Yugoslavia, as we can see it already, was falling apart. And after the peacekeepers were deployed, although they were deployed, they took quite little action. The Srebrenica massacre, for example, no shots were fired by the Dutch peacekeepers that had been guarding the area. And this is because the UN tried to remain as neutral as possible in order to appease both the Serbs as well as the Croats and the Muslim Bosnians. So, thus, they didn't give any consent for NATO airstrikes, although they were being pushed very heavily by the United States and a few other countries, more notably the UK later on, until after Srebrenica. And this is because, understandably, there were European soldiers in the area that the UN had sent there as peacekeepers, and the US could afford to be very gung-ho about sending NATO airstrikes into the area when they didn't have any of their troops on the ground. So there are two sides. However, it did lead to perhaps more deaths than would have occurred otherwise. And then systemic was the more kind of pertinent lens to apply here. However, there is a case to be made for both state and sub-state. State-wise, Yugoslavia was a major country in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the USSR. And so the splitting of the government obviously leads to a lot of turmoil. And additionally, Yugoslavia supported the Serbians. So the Yugoslavian army was in support of the Serbians. So there were a lot of forces, and so thus the Serbs were able to really, really be the aggressors here, while the Muslims and the Croats, not so much. At a sub-state level, the Serbian anger over the decision to leave Yugoslavia contributed a lot. That's an individual group that really started this ethnic cleansing. And there was a rising nationalism in all of the groups, not only the Serbs, but also the Muslims and also the Croats. And so now to move on to the Rwandan genocide. So who was involved? There were two tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And so the Hutus made up about 85% of the population, a huge, huge majority. They were a Bantu people. The Tutsis were the minority of the population, but when Rwanda was colonized by the Belgians, they were declared superior and the ruling class. And so each Rwandan was handed an ID card by these colonialists. And so it's said that if a Rwandan had 10 or more cows or had more Caucasian features, they would become Tutsis. And all the rest would be Hutus. And there's another smaller tribe, but it makes up a very, very small percentage of the population. What it was, so it's important to note that Rwanda had been embroiled in a civil war since 1990 at this point. And so it went from 1990 to 1993. And so this war was between the Rwandan Armed Forces, the RAF, versus the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. We can take this to mean that the RAF were the Hutus, generally, and the RPF were the Tutsis. And this was ended by the Arusha Accords in 93. which the UN did supervise. And following this, there were a series of events that led to a genocide in 1994, which was, was really just this systematic murder of Tutsis and of moderate Hutus. 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. This included women and children. Not that their lives are any more important than men's, but they did not discriminate, is what I'm trying to say. So where it happened in the very small country of Rwanda, all over the country. It happened in 1994 is when the genocide started. On April 6th, Juvenal Habyarimana, I hope I said that right, was killed in a plane crash. He was the president of Rwanda. He was killed along with President Taryamira of Burundi, as well as many key officials and their crew. So just to stay on this for a bit, there was a French judge, and he accused the Tutsis of gunning down the plane and assassinating the president, and the Hutus sided with the judge, obviously, because this was a Hutu president. The Tutsis, however, claimed that it was the very extremist Hutus in order to provoke, once again, a war between the two tribes. So why the entire, event occurred? There were still lingering hostilities in Rwanda, really, really strong ones. And this was because of 20 years of an imbalanced society where the Tutsis were superior to the Hutus as established by the Belgians. They had better jobs, they were wealthier. Almost similarly to how in South Africa the Afrikaners were superior to the blacks or the colored people. And so additionally, in 1959, there were riots protesting the Tutsi superiority. So the country had a really, really long history of violence between the two groups, leading up to that civil war that started in 1990 and really, I believe, continued through the genocide. I consider that to be one event. Sorry about the dogs. But so the spark would have been that the Hutu government blamed the assassination on the Tutsis, and all of the Hutu people followed. There was rampant propaganda. Everyone was joining militia if they were a Hutu. It turned neighbors and families even against each other. And it continued without any additional UN support or peacekeepers. So the only peacekeepers that were there were already there because of the Arusha Accords, actually. It was the UNAMIR. Did I say that right? Yes. And so they were there to ensure that the Arusha Accords were going well. It was only about 2,000 troops. All right. So how did this occur? We're going to look at these again through the lenses of analysis. So systemically, little was done by the international community. The peacekeepers that were sent in were inadequate because they weren't prepared to deal with a full-on genocide. They were only there for the Arusha Accords. They weren't trained properly. There were little to no supplies for some contingents, notably the Bangladeshi one. Some didn't even have weapons. And so considering the scale of this genocide, 800,000 people killed in 3 months, roughly. That's crazy. They just were completely unprepared. There were only around 2,400 peacekeepers in the area, so it was a disaster. State-wise, this actually gives a little bit more information on what happened as well. So militias were given lists of Tutsis or of moderate Hutus even. They killed, and then these militia then went to kill them and their families. Roadblocks were set up to check IDs, because at the time, everyone had an ID, and each ID had the person's ethnic identification, I suppose, on it. So if you were a Hutu, your ID said Hutu, and if you were a Tutsi, your ID said Tutsi. And so militia would set up roadblocks, and they would check people's IDs, and if it said Tutsi, then they would be slaughtered with machetes. And then to the right, you can see here this picture of a Tutsi man who had been just really cut up by a machete. It's a really graphic scene. And yeah, this happened. it's crazy to believe that he's one of the ones that was fortunate to survive, because then you can't even imagine what the other people must look like. And it's been described as a rape war by many historians, or I suppose government workers, and this means that the Hutus would rape Tutsi women before murdering them in many, many cases. Um, at a sub-state level, as mentioned before, the tensions between the two ethnic groups were very, very high. A lot of Hutus were also forced to kill their Tutsi families, um, or else they would be killed themselves. These frenzied killings by the government and soldiers and militia that were starting to join created this huge restlessness in this already chaotic, tense country, and so the more people started to join, it was almost like a snowball effect. That so many just regular men, as you can see in this picture here, regular Hutu men would just join this militia and just start slaughtering Tutsis. And so a lot of people had already lost loved ones during the Civil War. So many Hutus perhaps were trying to seek revenge. They were angry. And overall, it was just a really, really sad and angry environment. And so the responses of the UN to each of them were obviously different. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, although the UN peacekeepers didn't necessarily prevent the Srebrenica massacre from happening, they did provide a presence in the country. They were able to provide food convoys. They were able to provide a lot of different necessities for the Muslims that were being, detained. And they were able to help to some extent. And most importantly, they were actually sent in. Rwanda, however, didn't receive any additional help beyond the UNAMIR, right? Yeah. Peacekeepers already there that had only been stationed there to ensure that the Arusha Accords, the aftermath of that, would go as planned. I think I think I already said this, but just to go over it again. So peacekeepers were deployed to Bosnia in 1992. It was spearheaded by the EU, thus the name EUFOR. Peacekeepers were armed and provided with basic supplies. They were also trained to handle with this, crazy, violent environment. And additionally, the UN did eventually allow NATO airstrikes, so they did allow outside aid. Rwanda, however, they were severely lacking in resources and logistics. Peacekeepers were sent unprepared in response to the crisis. I meant that to say that, they were there not because of the genocide. So, yeah, they were just untrained, didn't have basic supplies, and had no or very poor quality weapons. And then looking at this at a systemic level, Bosnia and Herzegovina, I believe that it really comes down to that they are a European country while Rwanda is not. It's an African country. And European countries, it's much closer in proximity to powerful countries in the UN. Germany, France, the UK, Italy, all these big countries, even Russia, a P5 nation, in addition to France and the UK. And it's a very close country to them. And so what happens there affect Bosnia and Herzegovina or the surrounding countries, but it affects all of Europe. And so obviously these countries are going to be very concerned about something like this happening. It's also considered to be higher in status and development than a country like Rwanda, so thus more worthy of aid in the eyes of the UN, or perhaps just easier to aid. And then the peacekeeping mission was spearheaded by concerned European nations. So these were countries around them that were worried about the situation. The UN had also been created in response to World War II, a war that was mostly centered in Europe, with the exception of some scuffles in North Africa and in Japan. But so many of the powerful countries in the UN are going to be European, and they're going to be concerned about something happening in Europe. Rwanda, on the other hand, it's an African country. It's really far removed from powerful countries in the UN. There aren't any African countries that are P5 nations, or really very powerful, especially at the time. They were considered to be just a poor, underdeveloped tribal country, and thus less worthy of aid. No powerful countries took action to encourage deployment of a peacekeeping mission either. And so there weren't, the Congo, Uganda, none of those countries were able to spearhead these kinds of missions that the EU was. Not only because, not because they didn't want to, but simply because they didn't have the resources to do so. At a state level, Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was a country in turmoil, but both sides were committing injustices. So it wasn't a ruling government that was endorsing genocide. It wasn't a ruling government that was killing its own people. The Serbs allowed UN food convoys. They did commit atrocious acts, but there were certain things that the UN was able to do. However, in Rwanda, it was the Rwandan government that was carrying out these violations against human rights, and so they didn't want UN aid. And so it's a lot harder to enter into a country where you're unwanted. So thus, it's not one of the only reasons, but it is one of the reasons that the only peacekeepers in the area were there already because of the Arusha Accords. And then other factors to consider, though. Actually, I'm not going to go over sub-state just because there wasn't really much to talk about there. But I think it's important to mention other factors. And so in Bosnia and Herzegovina, after the attack in Srebrenica, which had over 7,000 casualties, it was by far the largest attack, NATO was sent in and they attacked. They dropped, they, had airstrike missions that focused on Serbian territories. And so they really knocked back the Serbian forces enough that it was able to be an even playing field, which led to the Dayton agreements. And that's what really led to the end of the war, as the NATO attacks were in 95, and that's when it ended. The UN wanted to remain neutral. They were really opposed to the idea of an airstrike until after Srebrenica, when they realized that perhaps it was the only way, and then they gave permission to NATO to attack. Without NATO interference, however, the conflict likely would have continued. Perhaps it would have gotten bloodier. Certainly, many, many more people would have been killed. And so a lot of the success of Bosnia and Herzegovina, not that it was a success, it was, I'd argue a genocide, or maybe not, definitely a human rights violation. But it was significantly less casualties than Rwanda. And comparatively, I believe that this is because of the NATO interference. Without them, the conflict would have escalated and perhaps would have gotten to the same scale of Rwanda. But in Rwanda, there was no NATO equivalent to step in. As NATO has jurisdiction, I suppose is a word to use, or their focus is Europe and other countries involved in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But Rwanda, Africa doesn't have this kind of an organization. They just had Rwanda. All they had was the UN, which is it's bureaucratic, it's slow, it's trying to be a kind of a peacekeeper is what it's trying to be, and it's unwilling to take violent measures in order to do so. It wants to remain as neutral as it can because it's supposed to be representing all countries, and so I'd argue that the same thing that happened in Rwanda maybe would have even happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as the UN peacekeepers are very unwilling to take risks and to become violent, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is the case. And in Rwanda, perhaps violent measures were necessary to be able to halt these killings. No one will know. But so this is a far-off picture of the airstrikes by NATO in Bosnia. And so just as an overview of the presentation, as we're coming to an end here, there was definitely an increased UN response to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And while perhaps the UN didn't do much, and it was NATO that maybe was the really strong factor in that conflict, the fact that they sent in so many more troops than they sent into Rwanda which was none at all, is just a really a grievous act that it shouldn't have happened. The UN should be sending the same amount of support to any country that needs it, but that's not the case. The UN is a flawed institution. It can't be perfect. All right. So those are my works cited: primary sources, secondary, and images. All right.